So let's start. Hello everyone again. Welcome to our today's webinar on cutting crime impact, promoting continuity in neighborhood policing through human-centered design. My name is Margot Mortenbohr. I work at the DPT-E, the Institute for Applied Prevention Research at the German Prevention Congress, and I'm very happy to be your host today. Today's webinar is the second webinar CCI webinar series in which we take a closer look at several aspects of the EU-funded research project Cutting Crime Impact. In this project, 12 partners from 7 countries developed very practical tools to support law enforcement agencies and police forces in different fields of police crime prevention. And in the first webinar in March, we mainly talked about the very special methodology of this project. And today we will talk about community policing. You may have noticed that there are different terms. Some people talk about community policing, some talk about neighborhood policing, others talk about proximity policing or human-oriented or citizen-oriented policing. This differs from country to country, for example, and what this kind of policing is mainly about, we will learn today. As speakers today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Megan O'Neill and Dr. Roberta Signori. Megan O'Neill is a reader. So the next slide, exactly. Dr. Megan O'Neill is a reader in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Dundee and an Associate Director of the Scottish Institute for Policing Research. And she will give us an overview of neighborhood policing first, especially in the UK. And Roberta Signori works as a research fellow at Greater Manchester Police, which is one of the LEA partners in the project, short GMP. And there she has developed one of these practical tools in the field of community policing, which she will present today. And of course, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Dagmar Heinrich. She's a research fellow at this project as well, working at the Design Against Crime Solution Center at the University of Salford. And she will support us with the moderation today. So she will moderate the discussion and your questions in the end. Before we start, I would like to give some technical advice. First, the webinar will be recorded, so if some of your colleagues are not able to attend today, they are able to watch the recording afterwards. And secondly, of course, you have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments, and you do this by clicking the small question mark in the speech bubble. Then a small window will open where you can type in your question or your comment. And feel free to use this already during the presentation because Dagmar will read them and then we can discuss them later on. With that, I would like to give the floor directly over to Megan and wish all of you an interesting webinar.
Thank you, Margot, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar today. I'm delighted to be speaking to you about community policing and in particular neighbourhood policing and how that has developed in the UK and in England and Wales specifically. So what we will do is I will present for about 15 minutes and then I will hand over directly to Roberta and she will do her presentation about the CCI project and the work that they've done. So we will address your questions at the end after the two presentations together. So Roberta is currently in control, so I would like to ask her please to go to the next slide. Thank you. Great. Okay, so just to begin, as Margot identified, we often hear lots of different terms when it comes to this idea of community policing. Generally speaking, and one reason for that is that community policing will vary from one jurisdiction to another, and that's part of the intention behind this method, is that it adapts to the local context. So the way that community policing works in any one area will not necessarily be matched in another. It will vary from one place to another, and that's on purpose. However, what this means is that it's difficult to find one clear definition of what community policing is. It can be quite vague in terms of what exactly it means. One definition has suggested that community policing is a strategy to allow community residents and police to work together in new ways to solve problems of crime, fear of crime, physical and social disorder, and neighborhood decay. So you see in that definition, we do have this idea of crime being one goal, but also there's many others, which are not specifically about reducing crime. So it's about reducing the fear of crime, social disorder, decay, and physical attributes of neighborhoods. So some people might think that what does this have to do with policing? But the idea is that this type of policing addresses problems in the community that may result in crime or come to the attention of police. So the idea being to try to work with communities to address these issues before they become too big, and to sort of nip things in the bud, as it were. So a lot of this comes about because of previous dissatisfaction with the police, that some communities do not have very good relationships with the police, and addressing these social order problems is seen as one way to try to repair that damage. Another rationale is about community members should be involved in the policing of their local areas and have some sort of a say. So it's policing with rather than policing of the communities. And the idea being that we need to address problems rather than the police just constantly responding and reacting to events, but to address the roots of problems from the beginning. Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So while it varies from one place to another, we can identify some common principles. So for example, this often involves police officers being very accessible to local residents. So local residents will have a clear idea of who the police officers are in their local area and how to reach them. And the police will work with local residents to address their crime and safety issues. So the idea being that the police, to some extent, will take the lead from the local residents and listen to what the residents say are their issues rather than telling them what their issues are. It also involves a two-way communication process. So the police will feed back to local residents about their progress, what they've done to address their concerns. And so it's not just one-way communication, it's two-way communication between the police and local residents. So when we want to try to work towards preventing crime as well as improving relationships between the police and the public. Other elements might involve visible foot patrol, and this is a key element when it comes to community policing in the UK, that visible foot patrol is a key part of this. It also involves working with other public sector agencies. So the police don't work in isolation. They connect with other agencies such as housing, education, health services, social care, a whole range. So it's about bringing together all the groups who might be involved in solving a particular issue. There is often a focus on building a local collective efficacy, so helping communities to come together in ways that perhaps they haven't before. So thus community policing is both a process and a product. It's a way of doing things, and it's also an end result in itself. Okay, next slide, thanks. So some of the benefits, why are we doing this? Numerous research studies have shown, especially in England and Wales, that the public like to see visible foot patrol. They like to see the police out on patrol, although there's a caveat to that, which I'll come to. This can help some publics to feel safer, to feel more reassured if they see a visible police presence. This shows that the police are providing this kind of social control function that many would like to see, and it can help improve relationships between the police and the public. So having a police organization that is responsive, that listens, that communicates, can help build relationships. It can also help the police themselves, in that if they have better relationships with their public, they'll get more information from that public about things that are happening and help to build intelligence networks that police officers need in the course of doing their work. Okay, next slide. As with anything, though, there are some drawbacks and there's some difficulties and challenges. So as I identified at the beginning, it is difficult to define. There's no clear definition and it varies quite a bit. So it can also, this can mean that it's difficult to understand what exactly it is and therefore how to do it. This can also mean that sometimes it's easy to do badly, that organizations can say they're doing community policing when really they aren't, and it's not actually all that different from a reactive style. There doesn't seem to be a direct link to reduction in crime. It can be difficult to find a causal link between community policing methods and a quantitative reduction in crime in a particular area, at least not on its own. So sometimes we can have, there is some evidence about community policing in conjunction with other methods having an effect, but it can be difficult to find a quantitative connection. And for some police forces, this is problematic, that they need to see that numeric connection. For others, the emphasis is more on the relationships and the community building, which you can't really quantify. Community policing does tend to be based on a geographical understanding of community, which, as I'm sure we all know, isn't always accurate, especially in the 21st century. Many people belong to online communities or communities of interest, which don't necessarily have a physical space, a physical presence. Community policing tends to be based on an assumption that there is community cohesion, that there is an identifiable community that we can find and work with. This might not always exist. You know, a geographic area may not have a cohesive group of people that want to engage with the police. So linked to that, it assumes the public want to be involved in their own policing. Some may not, and this is the caveat. Some groups may feel they are already over-policed. They have too much attention from the police and therefore don't actually want more police in their area. And finally, it can be expensive and time-consuming. It's a slow roll process. It's about building relationships and making connections and solving problems. It's not quick. It doesn't result in a quantitative, set of numbers for effect. It's a much more qualitative exercise. This means it is often dropped when other pressures become too great for policing agencies. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Okay, I think I'll just go through some of this kind of quickly because I'm aware of the time. So in terms of the background, community policing in England and Wales in the 80s and 90s was not fantastic. There was an emphasis to try to get the police out of their patrol cars, which had become quite popular in the 60s and 70s, to get them back on foot patrol. However, it wasn't very clearly defined what it was the officers were meant to be doing. So the idea being that there's visible foot patrol, get to know communities, build intelligence. It was kind of vague. So the result was it didn't end up having a noticeable impact in a positive way in the main. So community policing was often seen within police organizations as a punishment. You were sent there if you messed up as a detective, for example, you were put back into uniform, or it was seen as a place where older officers would go if they were about to retire. So in the 80s and 90s, we tried to do community policing, but there wasn't a very strong picture of what it meant and resource behind it. Okay, next slide. So moving into the 2000s, there was a pilot launched in 2003 by the Home Office called the National Reassurance Policing Program. So it was a trial of a new approach to community policing. And the idea of reassurance here was really quite important. So it's very much emphasizing the fear of crime debate, which had been going on. The idea being that while the overall crime rate was dropping, people's fear of crime seemed to be going up. So the thought was, well, if we can address these elements that are making people fearful, then that might help to reduce their fear. They would live happier lives and have better relationships with the police. So the idea here, it wasn't about crime reduction to begin with, but more about reducing fear and improving relationships. And the police were seen as quite important, that they would act on things happening in local areas that were making people fearful, but very much taking the lead from those local residents as to what was important to them in their area. And so that could vary from one place to another. Okay, next slide. Thanks. Right, so the reassurance policing was evaluated and it was found to be very successful in 2006, but it was changed slightly. So the title of reassurance was dropped and it was changed to neighborhood policing. So it was in 2006 that we started to talk about neighborhood policing. And this idea of reducing crime was added as a goal, and the focus became more on geographical areas as opposed to reassurance as such. The national rollout was completed in 2008, and what's quite fundamental to this approach and does make neighbourhood policing in England and Wales stand out compared to other jurisdictions is that there was a fundamental change to how the police organisation was structured, that the neighbourhood policing team became the basis on which policing was organised in every police force. So the neighbourhood policing team was the foundation of face-to-face policing. Officers who worked in neighbourhood policing teams were not to be abstracted to other duties. They were supposed to stay within that work, to do that preventative face-to-face and to not respond to emergencies unless absolutely necessary, so that they would have this time to get to know their communities and to work with partner agencies. So there was a lot of resource put behind this method, so a lot of funding. It reorganized the whole police force, and there was a clear financial investment from the government from the very beginning. So it was very clearly seen as a high priority for policing organizations. Okay, next slide. And one important element in here to mention, and not just because I did a huge research project on it, but because they are quite important to neighborhood policing, are police community support officers. So these were created in 2002, so they actually predate neighborhood policing. But now police community support officers are an integral part of neighborhood policing teams. So what's important to highlight is they are not police officers. They are civilian members of staff who wear a uniform. And as you can see, the uniform is deliberately very similar to that of police officers. But their job is to provide that visible foot patrol, that reassurance, engaging with the residents, building relationships. And they can address very low-level crimes, antisocial behavior. They do a lot of problem solving. They do a lot of the face-to-face work that doesn't necessarily need someone with the power of arrest to take forward. So they in effect sort of free up the time of police officers to get on with that other type of work. Things to mention: there's very little opportunity for promotion. Usually you're a PCSO and that's it. And as I say, their powers are very limited. They can issue some fines, but that's about it. There's about 10,000 PCSOs in England and Wales at the moment, and that represents a drop of 40% since 2010, and I'll talk about that next. So do next slide. Okay, so this is just my final points of note. So in 2010, the UK entered a 10-year period of austerity. So this is on the back of the financial crisis of 2008. A coalition government of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats came in, and they decided to reduce public funding across the board. So policing experienced a drop of funding of 20% between 2010 and 2015. So this meant that police officer numbers fell. So people who retired or quit were not replaced. PCSOs, because their staff, they could be made redundant, and so their numbers dropped by 40%. And one police force in police dropped the role of PCSO entirely, so they no longer exist in Norfolk Police. So this also brought with it a change to the funding arrangement. So the ring fence was lifted, and therefore it was no longer a dedicated method in England and Wales, and therefore it now varies considerably from one police force to another. It's highly variable. So my final observation would be that I would suggest that although community policing can be expensive and can be time consuming, it is worth protecting even in the face of other pressures, because having those relationships with communities can help the police to achieve what they want to achieve, especially when times are difficult. So I will leave it there. That's our overview of neighbourhood policing, and I'll hand over to Roberta.
Thank you, Megan, for your presentation. So my name is Roberta. I am a CCI Research Fellow for Greater Manchester Police, or GMP. And today I will be presenting the experience of GMP within the Cutting Crime Impact project. As you are aware, the Cutting Crime Impact, or CCI project, is a 3-year project that is funded through the Horizon 2020 program, and it involves 6 police forces in Europe, as well as other research and consultancy organizations, and the whole consortium is coordinated by a team at Salford University by Andrew and Caroline, who presented during the of this series. So the aim of this project is to support the police forces involved in researching and developing evidence-based tools or toolkit in 4 key areas. Greater Manchester Police worked in developing a tool in the area of community policing. So I know during the first webinar of this series, Andrew and Caroline talked in details about the approach of the CCI, which is the human-centered design approach. For the purposes of this presentation, I will just want to focus on a couple of things. The first thing is that, as Megan explained, community policing is all about building relationships with the police and citizens. So it's all about building the trust that is needed for this relationship to be effective, for collaborative working to be effective. In this context, technology-driven innovation are not necessarily beneficial, and sometimes they can even be detrimental if they disrupt that face-to-face component of community policing work. In this sense, the human-centered design approach, unlike technology-driven innovation, involves a bottom-up process that aims to understand the operating environment of end users, their needs, their circumstances, their role, and work with end users throughout the whole process in order to identify problems, define solutions, and develop tools. So the end users are at the core of the human-centered design approach. So how did GMP use this approach for developing this a tool in community policing? So the first thing that we did was to undertake what is called research. So basically, we use qualitative techniques such as shadowing, observation, and interviews with end users. And with end users, I mean not only frontline officers, but also people involved, citizens involved in community policing and key GMP partners, in order to understand how community policing was delivered within Greater Manchester, what were the issues, what were affecting end users, what were their experiences. Then we, at the end of the requirements capture research, we identified several key themes that we analyzed and reorganized into key findings. And these key findings were presented during a so-called design lab. Now, a design lab is an opportunity for all CCI partners to come together and share the key findings of their requirements capture research and work on reframing the problems identified during the research and generating new ideas and solutions to these problems. So at the end of the design lab, we had several ideas for of solution to the problems that we have identified, and we selected one concept direction for the development of an evidence-based tool. And then we started working on developing this tool, following interactive cycles of design and prototype testing, meaning that we first designed the first prototype, we went to end users, we asked for their feedback, we went back redefining, improving the prototype, we went back again to the end user, gathered more feedback, so back and forth until we were satisfied that users were happy with the final prototype. So what was the problem that we identified? So as Megan said, PCSOs are and also NBOs, who are the basically community police officers, have to build relationship with local community, and they often spend several years working within the same beat. A beat is a smaller part of a neighborhood, and during this time they acquire unique knowledge and understanding of their local area, its resources, its problems, the dynamics between groups, and they also build key connections and trust with people living in the local area. And all this resource of knowledge and connection sits in their head and is nowhere to be found on databases or documents in GMP. So the problem is when a PCSO or NBO moves to another post, they take with them all this resource of knowledge and relationships and connection. And we found evidence that the movement of PCSOs and NBOs out of their beat area is a huge cause of frustration for communities and GMP partners, and it does have a negative impact on their trust and their perception of GMP, and generally speaking even of the police. So I'm showing you some of the quotes that we collected during the requirements capture research that show how this issue of lack of continuity of neighbor policing roles can be a pressing problem that affects the delivery of community policing. So again, for community policing to be effective, you need to build that trust that is necessary for collaborative working to be effective. The problem is that in order to build the trust, officers have to demonstrate that they have in-depth knowledge of their local area and that it's dynamic, it's problem, and it's something that happens over a long period of time. And as you can read in the quote on the bottom right, it does take a long time to build trust, but it takes very little to destroy. When you of staff, you lose that relationship that has to be built from scratch, and that affects reciprocity and trust between the parties. So what was the solution that we designed? So the idea behind the solution is very, very simple. We thought we need a good handover protocol that is tailored to the specific roles of neighbor policing officers and staff. So we developed this tool, which is called Community Connect. That is a handover protocol specifically designed for neighbor policing roles that is to be used when a MBO or PCSO is leaving their post in the current beat, and it aims to encourage a face-to-face handover that involves people and key connections in the community. So that involves also the community. And how does this tool work? So there are three components. The first one is called Community Map, and it is a document that is completed by the living officers, and it aims to capture a PCSO or MBO's unique knowledge of an area, a local area. It is not supposed to be an exhaustive handover document, because this handover protocol is not about paperwork. The community map is supposed to support and facilitate the briefing day, which is the second step of this handover protocol, and it is the actual core of the whole handover process. And basically it is a face-to-face meeting and walk around that involves the living officers, the newly appointed officers, and some key contacts and partners in the local area. The final step of this handover protocol is a social media handover notification, which explains how the handover should be communicated on relevant social media. Now, I'm going to talk you through some of the features of the community map, just so you have an idea of how it is structured and how it works. The first section of the community map is about key relationships with local communities. We are asking here living officers to identify people with whom they build good, positive relationship built on trust, and people who the living officer thinks that might help the newly appointed officers in their new role. Then we have key places in the bid, which could be relevant for several reasons, maybe because they are meeting points of hard to reach groups, because they are unsafe, or because they are crime hotspots and should be pointed out during the handover. Then we have a section for key partners. We are not asking leaving officers to write a directory of all the partners that are relevant to an area. We are only asking them to identify those partners with whom they've worked very closely, face to face, to solve issues in the local area. Then we have a section for community priorities. This could be incidents, events, threats, initiatives that the leaving officers has been working on and would like the newly appointed officers to continue. We also provide free pages for further notes where the leaving officers can write in narrative form whatever information they might deem relevant for the handover purposes. And then at the end of the community map, we ask the leaving officers to indicate whether they wish to be contacted after they have left their post by the newly appointed officer for the purpose of arranging a briefing day. And this is especially useful because, as I will explain later on, very often officers are redeployed within GMP in a matter of days, and they do not have time for a face-to-face handover, but they still work for the organization, so for GMP, so they might be available to be contacted for arranging a briefing day. Now, as I mentioned before, the briefing day is the actual core of the handover because it involves a face-to-face meeting and walk around between the leaving officer and newly appointed officers, during which they go and meet the key people, the key contacts identified in the community map. They go and see the key places identified in the community map, and so that also key contacts in the community are involved in the handover. The third step is the social media handover notification. Basically, is a one-page document that provides template message leaving officers and newly appointed officers that they have to be posted on Neighbourhood Policing team's social media to inform the wider community that someone has left the team or someone new has joined. Now, this was an overview of the tool that we have developed, and now I would like to talk you through some of the lessons that we've learned so far, especially now that we are at the early implementation of this tool. So the first thing I'd like to stress is that there were clear benefits of adopting a bottom-up human-centered approach to the development of this tool. The thing is, we were able to identify a problem a huge problem that affects end users of community policing, but that was not in the radar of GMP leadership. It was not on their priorities. It was not on amongst their priorities. It was not on their agenda. We identified this problem and we brought evidence of this problem to the attention of GMP senior officers and leadership, and that happened because we were able to adopt this bottom-up approach, and we were able to work collaboratively with end users throughout the whole process, but we were also able to work with a multidisciplinary teams of designers and researchers and consultancy agencies within the CCI consortium. So these were clear benefits. I think the real challenges we found were at implementation stage, because just to clarify, the implementation of this tool is still ongoing. The big question is, how do you implement a tool that has been developed following a bottom-up approach within a police force where everything follows a very hierarchical structure, a top-down approach? And we were met with several challenges that were caused by connected organizational, cultural, and circumstantial factors. In terms of organizational factors, a huge problem was the high turnover of senior managers and leadership, which is ironic because we are developing a tool for addressing turnover of frontline officers and staff. Obviously, when there's high turnovers at a leadership and senior managers level, it's difficult to maintain the same level of commitment and engagement and coordinate action across the organization. Another big problem that we found, possibly the main one, is the way resources are deployed for in community policing, because the deployment is very transient, and as I mentioned before, officers are redeployed within a matter of days to other roles, or they are abstracted and they are asked to do something else, and they have to leave their neighborhood policing role, and they don't have there's no protected time for the handover, and this obviously doesn't help a face-to-face handover process. Moreover, at the moment, GMPs does not have a system for tracking and quantifying the movement of officers in and out of their beat area, which makes it more difficult to understand the impact, the negative impact that this can have for communities in Greater Manchester. In terms of cultural factors, you might think, well, if I design a tool that is useful and I give it to officers will use it. That is not really always the case, and things are not so simple. We notice that very often officers are skeptical towards new practices, and because they have this hierarchical mindset. If they're not asked explicitly by their bosses, you have to do this, you have to use this new practice, you have to use this tool, they will not do it. Another issue that we found refers to the wider police culture and how neighbor policing fits within that culture. Megan before mentioned the fact that community policing is not wasn't, but still unfortunately it still is not regarded as a proper police remit, especially when it comes to community engagement. This means that PCSOs, especially PCSOs, but also some MBOs, do not feel as valued as other officers and staff within the organization. And for instance, a lot of PCSOs, they leave their job and apply for a position as police officers because they feel that if they are police officers, they would be more valued within GMP. And this obviously doesn't help staff continuity. Finally, there were some circumstantial factors that had a huge impact on the early stages of the implementation, and I'm referring mainly to COVID-19 crisis. So we did the requirements capture research, we developed the tool, and everything was fine. We needed to start to trial the tool, and COVID-19 hit. The crisis started, and it was virtually impossible to have face-to-face meeting and engage face-to-face with officers and senior officers. And from what we learned, it's officers do not do well with remote online meetings and emails. They're used to work face-to-face, and it's very difficult to maintain their engagement and commitment throughout the stages of the trial and implementation. Another issue that we found was that recently GMP was I think it was December 2020. GMP was under great pressure due to the result of an inspection that found that the way GMP provides support to victims of crimes need to be improved, and this meant that the leadership has to redefine their priorities, and it meant also an increase in the workload of those senior managers who had to address this problem that was found in the recent inspection, and other initiatives, other problems, including our tool, were not prioritized. So I gave you an overview of the best challenges that we met in the first stages of the implementation of this tool. So in concluding, what we've learned is that if there's anything that we've learned from, for instance, COVID-19 and crisis, is that face-to-face interaction, that confirmed that face-to-face interaction is paramount when it comes to neighbor policing. You can't get anything done if you cannot engage face-to-face with officers, with senior officers, with neighbor policing teams, and with the people who work with them, including key partners and citizens. So that face-to-face aspect, again, I can't stress it enough, needs to be protected, because otherwise it spoils the effectiveness of community policing. We also learned that to implement a tool, you need strong leadership buy-in and commitment. It was great that we could adopt a human-centered design approach, a bottom-up approach for developing the tool. But when it comes to implementation, you need to combine that with a top-down approach. We also learned, through the human-centered design approach, we were not only able to identify a problem that wasn't within the priorities of GMP, but we were also able to expose the need for more systemic changes within the organization. So we designed a good handover protocols specifically tailored to neighbor policing roles, which is great and is something that was really, really needed. But its impact, it can be limited if it's not supported by wider changes. And I'm referring to better redeployment strategies, improve professional status of community policing roles, better recruitment strategies. So we basically expose the fact that continuity of community policing is the outcome of a global strategy that ties together different levels. So at an executive level, you need committed senior managers who ensure that resources for community policing stay within community policing. At a frontline level, you need good handover protocol, and you need good staff and police officers. And at an organizational level, you need adequate redeployment strategies and recruitment strategies, and possibly also good training in community engagement. And that is the end of my presentation. And so if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Roberta and Megan, for those engaging presentations. We have got some questions from our attendees. I'll jump straight in with one for Roberta. I don't know, there we go. So Roberta, you have identified that the hierarchical structure of the police can be an issue. Is there currently, or have you created a strategy which is in place to bring senior leaders on board for giving officers time for the handover process?
Well, yes, so the strategy was threefold, so to say. The first thing that we did was to again identify a top-down approach. So we identified the most senior manager who was involved in the CCI project, and we asked him to promote the tool with other senior and mid level managers within GMP. And that was one thing that we did. So we asked for the collaboration of very senior managers. We also engage with senior managers, and I mean specifically with inspectors and chief inspectors, or the so-called district commanders in jargon, through several steering meetings, which is a steering group meeting, which are basically the periodical meetings that happen within GMP between inspectors and chief inspectors. So we presented the tool several times actually. We regularly update them about first about the trial, then about implementation. And then the last strategy that we couldn't really implement because of COVID was to do more face-to-face engagement with inspectors and chief inspector, which was, I think, the most effective part of the strategy, but we couldn't actually do it not until now because of COVID. And so the outcome of this strategy was, I mean, there were some chief inspectors and inspectors, some district commanders who were really interested and engaged, and they maintained their engagement throughout the process. And with them, we have actually done some good implementation work in their district. But several other senior managers, although they all gave positive feedback, they will all show enthusiasm about this tool. They kind of like they keep forgetting about it, and they do not prioritize it. So they're always very positive, but they do not follow up. They do not make sure that their officers actually use it, and they don't provide that necessary supervision. And I think, again, the underlying problem is that if you are working in an organization where community policing is not isn't considered as important as other things, then it will never be prioritized. So unless you find that the senior manager is actually committed and strongly believes in community policing, and specifically in community engagement, then it's really hard, and that is a cultural problem. So
Yeah,
and it's a huge obstacle for us.
Yeah, and I imagine also with COVID-19, the fact that you're clearly very passionate about this, the fact that you haven't been able to engage these senior managers face to face has also been a challenge in the implementation work. But obviously the implementation work is still ongoing, and the project has not yet been completed. So hopefully, as things start to open up, you will be able to engage people more.
And another thing that we are doing is actually resorting to these senior managers who actually really engage, and get them to promote the tool within other people in their rank, and try to get other senior managers on board, because we noticed that works. Because again, Absolutely. It's a very hierarchical organization. So if I as a researcher, I tell you about this tool, and you are a very senior manager, it's not the same as another senior manager tells you, oh, this tool works.
It's all about relationships, isn't it? Which is what community policing is, of course. So,
exactly.
Great. We've got a question here from Megan. Your book, Police Community Support Officers, provides a real insight into the PCSO role, including in relation to citizen engagement. So GMP-CCI research identified problems due to PCSOs leaving their posts without proper handover. Do you think this might be a problem for other police forces in the UK?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for that question. It's a really important issue, and yeah, absolutely, yes, this is an issue across England and Wales when it comes to police community support officers. I mean, as Roberta identified, there is a tendency for people who sign up to be PCSOs to stay in the role for a few years and then apply to become police officers. It's not exclusively the case, and certainly in my research, I did find people who were in the PCSO role for a number of years and were quite happy. But especially when we started to see a reduction in police officer numbers, it was harder and harder to get a job as a police officer. So people would become PCSOs first with a view to then becoming police officers. So it is very much an issue that people will only be a PCSO for a short period of time. And it's because the issue is that this really undermines the purpose of the role of PCSOs, which is to have that sort of slow approach to their work, and it's not reactive, it's not responsive, it's getting to know people, building relationships, building trust, getting to know communities. And if they leave or they get assigned, or the area gets redesigned and they get assigned somewhere else, all those relationships are broken, and it's all about social capital. So it is absolutely a difficult issue for all police forces. So I think having a tool that can help assist that transition from one PCSO to another would be extremely useful. I don't think it's realistic to say we need to stop PCSOs leaving, or we need to stop this constant change of staff, because I think that's endemic to policing. That's quite often what happens. So yeah, having some kind of process to ease that and to help retain that social capital, which at the moment tends to just sort of reside in the heads of the PCSOs, and then when they're gone, it's gone.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. So in general, does community policing work in all countries or jurisdictions?
Not necessarily, and this is something to keep in mind, because as identified, community policing it varies from place to place, and that's part of the nature of the method, so that's fine. But we do also have to be aware of historic relationships between police and communities, and there might be some countries where there perhaps were quite authoritarian regimes previously that are changing into a democratic policing model, but we can't immediately assume that if the police were to come into an area and say, we're here to build relationships and build trust, that people would say, yay, let's do that. And the reaction might be, what's going on? We don't trust you. 5 minutes ago, you were in here with machine guns, what's going on? So I think we do have to be aware that local context, historical and political relationships can also have an impact on whether or not community policing actually works in a particular jurisdiction or not.
So what does community policing mean in the online world, which we've obviously seen a massive shift towards that during COVID-19, but even before that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think we also have to keep in mind that when we talk about the online world, it's not a black or white, it's a matter of degree. And so a lot of the way that the police communicate with the public now is through online tools, so Twitter, Facebook, various things like that. People might become victims of crime in an online capacity, but they report it to a police officer that perhaps they know through community policing. So there can be a mix of the physical and the virtual. So there is an element here around police officers and PCSOs being aware of the digital side of people's lives and how best to interact and advise them on how to be safe online and those kinds of things. However, that's sort of keeping in mind community policing from a physical, geographical point of view. If we're talking about communities that only exist online, it's probably something quite different, and that might not actually be community policing in that regard. That might be something else to do with, if we're talking like, say, for example, an online community that's to do with LGBTI issues and relationships, that's maybe not community policing, that's maybe something else entirely. So it's difficult, and it is much more complex now, I think, than the case previously.
Another question we've got here is if there are actually examples where messaging apps such as, WhatsApp are being used in the context of neighbourhood policing. So do you think digital tools like that could support this kind of work?
They can. I think what we need to be careful of here is that yes, absolutely. We live more and more of our lives online. We use things like WhatsApp and Facebook and what have you. But we need to keep in mind, though, that people need to feel that they can trust the police to keep their data secure and to use it responsibly. So there is an element there in terms of the police being able to reassure people not only that they're listening to their issues and their concerns, but that they can keep their data secure and it won't fall into the wrong hands. It won't mean that they then become subject to retaliatory, abuse from other people in the community, for example, that data is held securely, as well as, there's response from the police. So yes, it can be, but I think the police do need to make sure that their own systems are set up to support that in a responsible and ethical way.
Absolutely. We've actually got another question here on data protection, and this is for Roberta, actually quite specifically about the tool you designed. So does the community map pose any issues in relation to data protection, especially when it comes to the contact details of local residents or partners?
So we had this tool assessed by the GMP data protection team, and the result of this assessment was that basically we are not asking officers to gather new contact details for the purposes of the of filling in the community map. They already have these contact details, and the way it works at the moment, they have them on notepads. They write on these notepads basically everything, email addresses and phone numbers, and so they already have these contact details within this in written form in these notepads, and what we're simply asking is to write them in a community map and share them with other officers, which is something that they already do. But because it could be because they are handling contact details and sensitive information, what we explicitly ask officers in the guidance document of this tool, which is a document that they can download alongside the community map. We ask them to save the community map on the shared drive, which is password protected. And if they want to print a written version of, if they want to use a printed version of the community map, they can do so, but they have to store it somewhere safely within the police station, or they have to destroy it once the handover meeting is the briefing day and the handover is finished. So basically that was the result of the assessment and the steps that we took to ensure that we protect the contact details. But as I mentioned, we're not asking officers to gather any information that they don't already have in their notepads or in their computers.
Thank you for that. So we've got a question here about, obviously, Roberta, you mentioned earlier that community policing is not necessarily seen as important or a traditional remit of policing, and therefore has low priority within the police organisation. So how could you make community policing more interesting for officers as well as senior managers, perhaps even as well as politicians?
Okay, so I think at the level of politicians and senior officers, I think the problem is that police performance is still assessed using indicators such as crime reduction. Like they always want to see or numbers of arrests. So when I'm out in the police station with officers, BCSOs and MBOs, they always talk about, oh, I need to go out and do some arrests because otherwise it looks like I'm not working, I'm not doing any work. So the problem is that the current indicators of performance of the police are not adequate for community and not tailored to community policing. So until we move away from quantifiable indicators such as reduction of crime, numbers of arrests, we will really struggle to prove and to demonstrate, to make the case that community policing is a valuable contribution to the police and to the society. So that is a wider problem, I think. And then at the level of the frontline level, obviously that affects also officers because they are asked literally by the supervisor, you need to go out and do some arrests because you need to, and we need to show that you're doing something, some work, some quantifiable work. But also I think that the way it works at the moment, for instance, PCSOs, and you can say, do not have any sort of progression opportunity in their career. They have very little incentive to stay within the same area, so I think I think that could be improved with like tailored job incentives and promotion opportunities. That is something that is not really done at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Roberta, and thank you, Megan, for answering those questions. We haven't been able to get through all the questions. My apologies for that. There were lots of really interesting ones. Just like to thank both of you for speaking, and also, you know, just Roberta giving us the overview of your GMP Community Connect tool, which I know you demonstrated last year, and you will be continue to be implemented throughout this year, and we look forward. Well, I'm sure all attendees will look forward to hearing more about its implementation at the final event in December.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks to all of you. Sorry for interrupting. It was very interesting, but unfortunately the time is over. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Roberta and to Megan for these interesting presentations, and especially for giving some insights into the work of GMP and the work of the PCSOs and MBOs especially. I really enjoyed doing this webinar with all of you. Thanks to Dagmar, of course, for moderating these couple of questions, and certainly there are some attendees from other countries here who can take some of the ideas and some inspiration to their own work. And finally, I would like to announce the next webinar in our CCI webinar series. It will take on the 18th of May at 4 p.m. again. And yeah, please save the date. We will provide further information on this as soon as possible. And yeah, I think that's it for today. Thank you very much and goodbye.